Welcome, everyone. I see that you're starting to enter into the Zoom room. We're really glad to have you with us today for our 21st Salon. I'm Letitia Layson, your moderator. Our guests, Jody Evans and Sonali Kolhatkar, will speak, followed by a question and answer. So right now, what I'd like to do is introduce Jody Evans. You may already know her. She has returned today, and we're just pleased to have her. Jody Evans is a longtime peace and social justice activist and co-founder of CODEPINK, Women for Peace. She was in Jerry Brown's cabinet when he served as governor of California in the 1970s, ran his Senate campaign in 1982 and his revolutionary 1992 campaign for president. She has led citizen diplomacy delegates to Iran, the Gaza Strip, Yemen, and Afghanistan, and has published 2 books, Stop the Next War Now, Effective Responses to Terrorism, and Twilight of Empire. She founded a campaign at CODEPINK, cultivating a local peace economy to address the need to change culture from a war economy culture to a peace economy culture if we want to achieve peace and justice, to a giving, sharing, caring, thriving, relational economy from an extractive, destructive, and oppressive economy. And I see that Sonali has joined us. So let me just do the introduction because they're going to talk, have a discussion. They'll be posing questions to you where you can answer in the chat. And once the major portion of their talk happens, we'll open it up a little more freely. So welcome, Sonali. We're so glad that you could join us today. Glad to have you.
Good morning. Hi.
Sonali is a journalist, activist, and artist. She is the founder, host, and executive producer of Pacifica's popular drive time program, Rising Up with Sonali, which airs on KPFK, KPFA, and also as a TV show on Free Speech TV. She's a writing fellow and Independent Media Institute with the Independent Media Institute and was formerly a weekly columnist at Truth Dig. Sonali is also the founding co-director of Afghan Women's Mission, a US-based not-for-profit solidarity organization that funds the work of RAWA. She's the author of Bleeding Afghanistan, Washington Warlords and the Propaganda of Silence. She lives in Pasadena with her husband and co-author James Ingalls and 2 sons. In addition to her journalistic and political work, Sonali is also an accomplished artist and has won awards for her work and displayed her pieces at many exhibits. Her favorite medium is acrylic on canvas, but she also dabbles in lino cut printing, wood burning, sewing, crochet, all around awesome artist. She's also an avid baker and my favorite chocolatier. So welcome, Sonali. And I understand, Sonali, that you're going to begin the conversation today and set us up. So when you're ready, you can begin and you just turn it over to Jody when you're ready.
Sure. I think it would be good to kind of start with a historical overview to understand what's happening in Afghanistan today. If we're interested in solidarity work with Afghan women have, been in the spotlight most recently because of the takeover of the country by the Taliban, And for people who are paying attention, this was very similar to the situation that took place 20 years ago. There was a lot of attention on women when the Taliban were in power and then toppled by the United States. So in order to sort of understand what women are going through right now in Afghanistan, that history is so crucial. Today, a 20-year-old in Afghanistan has known nothing but war. In fact, it was October 7th, so just a couple of days ago, that marked the 20th anniversary of the start of the latest US war in Afghanistan. So a 20-year-old in Afghanistan today has known nothing but war. But it's actually true that a 30-year-old has also known nothing but war, and even a 40-year-old has known nothing but war. If you sort of trace some of the history, you can go back to the late 1970s when the Soviet Union first invaded Afghanistan, bringing with them a message that was a bit similar to what the US brought in 2001, which was, we're going to free women from fundamentalist Islamic forces, among other things. The Soviet Union had some allies on the ground in Afghanistan, and it had a lot of people who didn't like the idea of being invaded by a foreign country and occupied. And from that point onward, there was a 10-year-long bloody war of occupation during which, something like 10,000 Soviet soldiers were killed, but more than 1 million Afghan people were killed. I mean, just imagine that, more than 1 million Afghan people killed in a 10-year period. And it was during this 10-year period that the United States decided that it wanted to participate in the Afghan war. There's a famous sort of thread that this idea that the United States thought it would be useful to give the Soviet Union its Vietnam. And so what better way to do that than to identify those indigenous forces that were fighting inside Afghanistan against the Soviets and put weapons in their hands. And the most ferocious, the most misogynist, the most fundamentalist elements that the CIA could find were given wads of weapons and cash. And they were known at that time as the Mujahideen, these holy warriors. There were many different factions of them. And they basically helped to bleed the Soviets, and the Soviets eventually left in the late 80s, which then kicked off a civil war between those same factions that the US had funded. The US did not do anything about the fact that it had poured weapons into Afghanistan. There was no disarmament process. There was nothing. So all those weapons remained in the hands of the Mujahideen, who then very predictably turned on one another and fought each other. And in the early 1990s, the first half of the 1990s, you saw an incredibly bloody civil war in Afghanistan. Kabul, the capital, was devastated. I mean, you still see shelled out buildings today in Kabul that if you ask someone, well, which war did this? You'll often hear that it was the civil war of the early 1990s, where these Mujahideen forces fought one another, and thousands of Afghans were killed in the crossfire, thousands upon thousands. And that's the context within which the Taliban enters Afghanistan in the mid-1990s, promising peace, an end to war, and once more promising to save Afghan women from these Mujahideen warlords who were very misogynist. They were war criminals. So the Taliban, took over piece by piece, very quickly took over the whole country. And the Mujahideen forces went underground. Somehow they magically put aside their differences. They joined forces and eventually called themselves the Northern Alliance. So for about 5 years, Afghanistan remained under, a sort of peaceful prison-like existence under the Taliban. The Taliban, enforced, and you might be more familiar with this aspect of Afghanistan, they enforced these edicts, very medieval style, fundamentalist edicts that they claimed were in line with Sharia law. Women were not allowed to leave their homes without a male escort. They were not allowed to attain education. They weren't allowed to be employed. They simply couldn't participate in society. It was around this time that I first heard about RAWA, the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan. They're the oldest feminist group in Afghanistan, and they had been basically fighting for Afghan women's rights since the Soviet occupation. They, saw foreign occupation and domestic fundamentalist misogynist terrorism as two sides of the same coin, and they opposed both in the interest of women's rights, secularism, democracy, education for women, full rights for women. This was not a Western-inspired organization. This was an indigenous group of Afghan women who lived inside Afghanistan and or in the neighboring refugee camps of the countries of Pakistan and Iran, because those borders are fairly porous. And so I learned about what was happening under the Taliban from Rawa. It was in 2000 that I first came across Rawa's website and was blown away by the fact that this brave group of Afghan women were fighting against the Taliban non-violently. And they were doing it in such remarkable, creative ways. They were smuggling books under their burqas. They were documenting human rights violations with cameras under their veils. They were holding underground classes for girls and women, training programs for women, microeconomy projects that were happening all underground at great risk to their lives. If a person was ever caught with any Rawa literature, it would land them into huge trouble. I mean, they could basically be jailed or killed. There was a very famous video that was shot by a Rawa member that of a woman, an Afghan woman being executed in Kabul Stadium. This happened in the late 1990s, and it was a horrific moment. The Taliban had called the public to gather in Kabul Stadium, and this woman who was accused of killing her husband because he had beaten her for being adulterous, was made to kneel on the ground in full view and shot in the back of the head. And a Rawa member captured this footage on a camera under her burqa. They tried to shop this footage around to the international media to call attention to what was happening, and nobody wanted to air it. People weren't interested. CNN wasn't interested. But it wasn't until the September 11th attacks, when the United States got hit by Al-Qaeda forces who were ostensibly being harbored by, or were in Afghanistan at the behest of the Taliban, that the world suddenly became interested in Afghan women's rights. And this video that Rawa had shot got a lot of attention. By then, I had already been working with Rawa for about a year and a half. We had set up an nonprofit organization, Afghan Women's Mission, which continues to this day. We were trying to raise money for a hospital project in Pakistan where Afghan refugees had no medical care. We were having a hard time raising money. And then when the September 11th attacks happened, there was a lot of attention. We were able to raise a lot of money because suddenly people were interested in what was happening to Afghan women. And suddenly the images of Afghan women's oppression were the perfect justification for the United States to launch its war, alongside, revenge for 9/11, which of course was never expressed in that way. It was always, we have to hold these terrorists accountable, etc. Even though, of course, we now know that the hijackers were from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Afghanistan was bombed. And the fact that the US would topple this misogynist force called the Taliban and therefore save Afghan women or liberate them was an added bonus. And so Afghan women's images, their plight was exploited as a justification for war. It was a very scary time for Rawa and even for their allies here in the United States, because we knew what this was going to do to Rawa. It was so that was the start of the latest 20-year chapter of war in Afghanistan. Under the United States occupation, things improved a little bit in some cities for some women, right? There were some opportunities for women to have education and employment, some of them within the US government, some of them within the nonprofit sector that then proliferated from US tax dollars being sent to Afghanistan. Some of my Rawa colleagues humorously call it NGOistan, NGO being non-governmental organization, which is what most of the rest of the world calls nonprofits. And they say that there was this parallel economy that was formed in Afghanistan, the NGOistan, which really corrupted the situation there. There was so much money flowing in that it just encouraged corruption. And a lot of the money ended up lining the pockets of the warlords. In the rural parts of Afghanistan, things were very different. You still had very similar situation. Girls' schools were built by US soldiers, burnt down by the Taliban. Not that many remain standing. In some pockets, Rawa was able to make some positive contributions because of the attention that they were getting from the outside world through donations. They were able to start their own projects and sustain them. And I want to just take a moment to say that the model of nonprofit work that Afghan Women's Mission decided very concertedly, very deliberately to take on was a solidarity model. Right from the start, none of us who started this organization, we were just a small group of like kind of people in science and tech. Many of us had not really, none of us had done any nonprofit work. And we did not want to take the standard nonprofit approach into Afghanistan. And the standard nonprofit approach is send in foreign trained staff to assess the need, make the determination, and then solicit proposals from people on the ground and ask them to give you measurable outcomes that you then assess every year and determine whether you want to keep funding them at based on a series of tangible outcomes that you determine are important. We did not want that dynamic between Afghan Women's Mission and RAWA. We wanted to flip the dynamic. Afghan women in Afghanistan know what Afghan women need. They know where the schools need to be built, how they need to be built, how they need to be staffed. They know where the training programs need to happen. They know how to set up their own economy. They live it. That's their life. That's his society. And so the way we have structured our nonprofit is that RAWA tells us what they need. They draw up a brief proposal. We fund it. We ask them to just give us some documentation of what they have done with it. And we keep funding it to the best of our ability. Our members have visited them, seen their projects firsthand, and that empowerment of RAWA as the leader in this relationship was really, really important for us. Of course, over time, the donations, the media attention dropped. People forgot about Afghan women because the sense was, oh, the US is there, they're safe. As long as the US is there, they're safe, which was, of course, absolutely not true. While the US was there, Afghan women were still suffering the bombings. Their families were being devastated. There were nighttime raids. There were drone killings. There was, increased terrorism from the Taliban, from the Islamic State. The same Northern Alliance warlords that had, decided to set aside their differences after fighting a bloody war had been brought by the United States to participate in the government of Afghanistan. So now they were ministers. They were members of parliament. And they were corrupt, and they had their own private militias, and they were terrorizing neighborhoods and rural areas. And, often maternal mortality and infant mortality rates are good measures of women's well-being in any country. Before the war started, Afghanistan had some of the highest, if not the highest, maternal and infant mortality rates in the world. That needle barely moved in 20 years. All right. So the idea that Afghan women were safe while the US was there was absolutely false. And oftentimes, anytime you, during the 20-year occupation, when you had, newspapers consider, well, what would happen to Afghan women if the US left? And they would show pictures of what was happening to Afghan women while the US was there, right? Pictures of women having acid thrown in their faces. But the caption was always, this is what would happen to Afghan women if we left. Not even seeing the illogical display of imperialist ideas in such a presentation. There was a terrifying trend that emerged in the middle of the occupation, right around 2010, in especially the western part of Afghanistan, where Afghan women were so unhappy and so deeply demoralized that they were burning themselves to death. Self-immolation. I mean, you can look it up. It was being reported in very small, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International did some great reporting on it. Self-immolation was such a trend that there were special units being opened in hospitals to treat it. Afghan women were so unhappy, they were literally burning themselves to death. This was happening during the US occupation. Anyway, media attention waned, the donation dollars dried up, and a lot of RAWA's projects have unfortunately had to shut down. Now we are seeing a lot of attention again. People want to give money again. They want RAWA to start projects again. And it's really interesting, to see the international community's response. I think if we really care about Afghan women, we can't forget about them again. And if we really care about their long-term well-being. We can never, ever, ever let their exploitation, rather let their oppression be exploited to justify war. War can never liberate women anywhere. It's not the kind of, especially one that the US leads. You cannot bomb your way into liberation. Women's liberation, and Rawa knows this and they've said this, can only come from an internal, long-term social and political movement building up from the inside out. And so all that outsiders can do is support those internal movements in constructive ways. And bombings, of course, never actually do that very well. So I'll stop here. I hope that gives you some context for what the situation is in Afghanistan today. And Jody, maybe you can jump in and share your thoughts.
Thank you, Sonali. I just want to say it's so lovely to be together with Sonali because I got to work with her 20 years ago on fundraising for the Afghan Women's Project and the hospital that eventually did get built. And Sonali went to the opening of it. And then Sonali brought some of the women from Rawa to the US, and we were able to buy a car for one of them because they knew what her car looked like and she was unsafe. So we've been working with Rawa for 20 years together. So I'm so grateful for Sonali for setting the context. So I'm going to take it from the US side, like what it, really looking at this gifting economy. And, as Letitia said at CODEPINK, I've really noticed early on that we were not going to end war until we ended the war economy, that war serves the war economy. And not only that, but it will do anything. It will contort anything as an excuse to go to war. And that we live in a war economy culture. It's oppressive, destructive, extractive, and it has fashioned all of us to behave in ways that serve it. And so, as Sonali said, here's a war that used women to start. Just feel that it was the use of women to start this war. Now, here's where, it gets complicated. It was women who wanted this war to start. And there were many women's groups, whole boards of women's groups that would come do interventions on me at my home because CODEPINK wanted to stop the war on Afghanistan. And so what happens to us that we think war, violence, weapons are the answer is, one of the things that I think the war in Afghanistan really exposes, that behind war is greed, totally. And so, and imperialism, which is a form, imperialism is a form of greed, a form of patriarchy, a form of full-on control. And so, how do we pay attention to how our hearts, how our desires to be in solidarity can be used? I also want to point out the class difference here. So I would say when I went to Afghanistan, I was also part of what was happening in Afghanistan prior to 9/11, because I was working with a friend who made a film called A View from a Grain of Sand, which did take some of the footage that Sonali talked about. It did follow 3 Rawa activists. And so that was happening before 9/11. So I was already, Afghanistan and the women meant a lot to me. But, and this is before the starting of CODEPINK. So in Afghanistan, you have the big cities, Kabul, and then you have the rural poor, you have the urban poor, you have displaced people. I think there's, given what Sonali said, there's 40 years of war. I think there's somewhere around 1 million widows. So, that's the makeup. So it's as diverse as, most countries. But what happened when we went to Afghanistan is the focus became about Kabul. It was like Afghanistan was Kabul. And what happened in there is that you had the spokespeople, spokeswomen, were from a certain class. And I'm afraid it's a class of women that did not pay attention or care about the other class of women. So I just want to bring this up in what I call the war economy, peace economy, in the sense of if you belong to the class of the war economy and benefit from it, it skews your viewing and your thinking and how you respond. So when we went in 2009, CODEPINK went to try to stop Obama from escalating the war on Afghanistan. And so under Bush, after he started the war in Iraq, the US military, kind of the war in Afghanistan was kind of quiet. There wasn't a lot happening. And in that period, things started to kind of settle. It was actually, people look back as in 2008 as a place of possibility and hope in Afghanistan. When we went there, the Taliban were being reintegrated into society. There was places where they went and courts of witness and commitments that they would make. And we went and watched it. I went and met with a lot of the Taliban. I met with a lot of the warlords. And you could see that this whole, as Sonali describes, this whole behavior had been set up, but it was always around war and weapons. And as Sonali said, you know, the Taliban, I think it's so interesting for Jen, is like, these were the motherless boys. These were orphans. And the gifting economy is the gifting that the care and love and concern of the gifting society isn't something they knew. And I also just want to point out that Afghanistan is harsh. And what a gifting earth, you know, like what it looks like in Tahiti and what it looks like in Afghanistan, create totally different societies, cultures, and ways of being. And I also want to say that Mother Earth has something to do with that also. That when you're in some place it's very harsh and hard to pull life support out of, it also creates a certain way of living. And so, you know, just looking at gifting and mothering and how we're held and what creates giving societies, I just want to point that out also. So when we were in Afghanistan in 2009, I learned some things firsthand. First of all, I was able to come back with 4,000 signatures from women that I met that said no to Obama about war. And that was pretty much almost everyone we met, except for the women that worked in the NGO complex. As Sonali points out, it's its own universe it's its own support mechanism. I would say it's got its own kind of gifting economy going on, but it doesn't fall over into everyone else. It becomes a structure that supports itself, and those in it, and it happens all over the world. So one of the things that, as I was meeting with the women in Parliament, one of them was a doctor from a territory that was right outside of Kabul, but more rural. And she said to me, "Who do you think the Taliban are?" She said, "I gave birth to those boys." And the United States acts like that they pit us against each other and act like there's good humans and bad humans. And it really was a, you know, in Jen's sense of, it was that moment of, here is a doctor who has given birth to these boys, and it really noticing that the answers from the United States are always weapons, war, and death. And that, as Sonali said, even the bringing in of money creates more war, because it's given in, like Sonali said, like in envelopes of too much money. It's not in a sense of value for value, in a sense of what needs to happen. It's almost a paying off so that you don't have to deal with the real issues, which I call the problem of war and peace. But it's so visible in Afghanistan. And I think that's why this conversation is important, because here's Afghanistan, that the decision to support the women was to go to war. You know, that is so freaking crazy. And now I think the conversation needs to be, what does peace look like? What does the giving economy look like in this moment? And so first it's, you know, let's look at that. And I actually was I was staying with George Soros the night before we were going to war, and I was screaming mad that how crazy could people be? Why, you know, don't they understand this is going to be a tragedy, blah, 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 blah. And he was just like, well, what's another answer? And I said, think of the amount of money that you're going to spend on war. What if you went and you gave every woman in Afghanistan that amount of money and let them create their economy? That's not anything anyone would consider. Do you know how cheap that would have been? Do you know the amount of what we spent one day on the war in Afghanistan, like, could fund the yearly bill on infrastructure that's in front of Congress right now? The war on terror cost $21 trillion. That's an unfathomable number. Unfathomable. But what's wrong with seeing the women? It's like we're going in to save the women of Afghanistan that aren't valued in their culture. That's true. That's very true. And it's hard to witness that inside the culture of Afghanistan, if you're born a woman, you're taught servitude. If you're born a boy, you're valued. You go to the doctor first. Why are there more men in Afghanistan than women? Because boys get the medical care. The girls don't get the medical care. The boys are valued, the girls aren't valued. So, you know, we can sit in the awareness that it's a culture that doesn't value the feminine. But why then did giving the money to men to bomb become the answer to how do you serve the women? Another thing is that that, you know, who we fought for many years, early like 2004 to 6, to actually get money to the women in Afghanistan. I had this idea early, so let's get money to the women. So we got it through Congress and got it through the Senate, $90 million, teeny number, right? $90 million. So part of why we went to Afghanistan to see how that money got to the women. And we witnessed when in 2 offices, all men writing, who got paid $50,000 to write a proposal for $5 million for a project that didn't really help the women of Afghanistan. We were working with women in a building, it was the women's building, where 500 women's projects were housed, and none of them got any of that money. So as Sonali said, she has, you know, worked to make sure the money gets to the women in Afghanistan and that they figure out what should happen. But Sonali is doing it the right way, but the United States of America and allies were just continually giving it to the men, and it never made it to the women who had the projects that were actually serving the women of Afghanistan. It got to, as some women said, the women that would raise up the story about women's rights, but not be doing what was affecting women's rights. And so, which is devastating. And it was devastating to watch and feel. And then we got to watch it again recently with the evacuation of Afghanistan, where it was the educated women and men but those that had a certain class were the ones that got out. It was even interesting as I was trying to raise money for some friends that I was worried about, like artists that I had met. The artists are still there. They can't get out because they don't have money, but the people that did get out had money. And one women's organization was raising money and asking the donors to give $50,000 to the life of the woman they were getting out. But we were raising 5,000 for the ones that could get to some of the African countries. So those that it was less to get out of the country couldn't get out. Those that it cost more could get out. So back to the class situation and how that plays out. I also, I just want to bring up also Julian Assange, who both pointed out what the war looked like in Iraq, that Chelsea Manning went to jail for exposing, and also the Afghanistan papers. I think that's almost 11 years ago. And that everything that was happening in Afghanistan was talked about, was exposed, and just like with Vietnam, the military knew there was no military solution. While in this last year, they dropped more bombs, I think, than the entire war, which was a lot of bombs already. And that the drone killings are, I mean, first of all, like, what's a target? Because when you're declaring war on a country, everyone is innocent because they're all defending themselves from you. So basically, we murdered 400,000 people in Afghanistan, and in the most gruesome, horrible ways that we, with our tax dollars, give permission to have happen. And there's been movies made, there's been stories told. I mean, we can't, any of us, play innocent to what was actually happening, and that women weren't actually being served. And it didn't take very much to know that. You just needed to go. Even in Kabul, when you saw how many women and their children were displaced by the greed and corruption that took place in Kabul, where you have the US throwing around a lot of money and generals coming in and needing, I think, I'm going to throw up some big numbers, but I remember one general was living in a place that cost $60,000 a month in Kabul. So like those prices were created and escalated by the US and then paid for by US taxpayer money. I mean, the level what's painful is, yes, the Afghan government is corrupt, but what doesn't happen is the responsibility of the United States for that corruption and the United States' own corruption in the process. And that's another thing I want to talk about that doesn't get talked about Afghanistan is the US corruption, and that this is all about money, and that $21 trillion is in the pockets of the rich, and it did nothing to help the women of Afghanistan, as Sonali said. We met with the Minister of Trade and asked him, like what was happening with US money, what was, was infrastructure being built, what was, what was actually happening, could he show us? And he showed us 4 projects. And I think the total bill for all of them was like 10 billion. And they were building projects like roads and freeways, and one was the freeway, the highway between Kandahar and Kabul. And it got priced out and billed out and agreed to at a $2 billion price tag to build. And he said he went to the people that were building it eventually, and they were a Turkish company, construction company, and they had been paid 500 million. So that rest of that money got pocketed by a company in Virginia, in the United States. And there's, tons more stories about that. The Minister of Trade finally decided that after the bombing, the escalation by Obama and Petraeus, and that those whole horrible years of more war, more devastation, and more rigidity, people moving into their tribal pockets, or everyone finding their pocket, and ISIS growing. The minister left Afghanistan and came to the United States and was hired by the US government to be a translator at the different bases in the United States. So he said he would book his ticket on Expedia, and it would cost like $200. And they would call him and say, no, you have to go through the travel agent that's owned by the general. And he would see what the ticket cost going through the travel agent owned by the general. And it was always 5 times more than what he had found on Expedia. So the level of corruption goes up and down the line. We met with the ambassador and the head of USAID, and I pled with the ambassador and the head of USAID. I was just like, why, after fighting all these years in Congress to get the money to the women, why can we not get the money to the women? And she said, well, their projects are just too small. So I was just like, what do you mean? He says, well, we can only fund, our system can only fund a project that's at least $20 million. I think maybe we could do some 5s. Now, no woman in Afghanistan is going to have the capacity. And then that's when I went to find out, what did it cost to write the grant, which was to pay this guy $50,000. And then he wrote a grant about something that had nothing to do with the women, except educating a couple who would become a judge and who could be spokesperson and travel to the United States and talk about how wonderful the women in Afghanistan were being treated by the United States. So that's just, and so now, trying to figure out what is local peace economy, what is peace economy, what is solidarity in this moment has been for CODEPINK to support RAWA. But I want to say getting money into Afghanistan is not easy. So the other thing that we're doing before we can get money into Afghanistan is we've been getting money to the area in Iran, right outside of Afghanistan, where many, many poor women have escaped to, but it's a very poor part of Iran. So I just want to remind everyone that Iran is under US sanctions that have devastated the country and totally destroyed the middle class. And it's a country of very, poor people that, by the way, is a peace economy. That it is still a place where the economy, the culture is a giving culture, that even when I was just there a couple of years ago with nothing, that the impulse is to give to another, to give to the other. So here they are taking in all these refugees with no food. So we've been getting planes of food delivered to that part of the country to feed both. And have a woman in California who's been able to do that. And then we have a guy in the Middle East that's been able to help. So it's, food, always for me, food first. And then the other thing is that we found out that the doctors and teachers had been being paid not through the Afghan government because it had run out of money, and it was not paying the teachers and a lot of the doctors. So at CODEPINK, working with that group, we're working in Congress, with Biden and the World Bank, to see if we can get the teachers paid and the doctors and the nurses paid. And we have I'll put it in the chat, a campaign at CODEPINK. There are 1,300 female healthcare workers, doctors and midwives and nurses, and there's 120,000 teachers. So in the sense of the gifting economy, those that care, being able to serve those that are essential and those that are doing the work of care is the first place we're going at CODEPINK. So I'll stop there. And Sonali, I thought maybe you and I could talk about even just what it's like to be women who live in the United States and the struggles we've come up against in trying to be in solidarity.
Well, actually, before I do that, I just wanted to follow up on a couple of things that you had just mentioned. The difficulty of getting money into Afghanistan. We're running up against the same thing. What we're doing is working with RAWA to get money into a Pakistani bank account. So just the same, like Iran and Pakistan being these neighboring countries where there are big populations of Afghan refugees. And we're working with a rice trading company it's using these creative ways to get them the first shipment of $10,000 of the money we've raised so far. And then once we can figure that out, we want to get them more money. And what they're doing with the money right now is they're trying to help internally displaced refugees find safety and shelter, food, clothing, medicine. And RAWA has been very clear that they don't want to have anything to do with efforts to fly people out of the country. They don't judge people who need to and for their own safety have to. But their goal has always been stay and fight for their rights in Afghanistan and in the refugee camps of Pakistan. So they're very clear about their work being done by the women who've lived there, who've always lived there, who've born there, like Afghan women themselves. And so they are not an organization of diaspora women. And to some of the class issues, Jody, you were bringing up, I think that's so critically important to bring up. And I saw the same thing there, depending upon whether women were well-to-do, Western educated, they tended to be more pro-occupation. Those who were working class, refugees, orphans, if they'd had any direct experience with loss through US funded war, they were really not, clear about not supporting the US occupation. So yeah, I think it's really, really important for us to see that the money that gets to Afghanistan and goes into Afghan hands and infuses at the very bottom and not through the contractors, the military contractors, and then definitely not the warlords. But yeah, it's been a challenge. It's been a challenge supporting RAWA as an American woman here, because I remember for 20 years, and especially near the beginning, RAWA came under all sorts of criticism for being too Western or not Western enough. And the too Western part was their values, right? Because they are the stereotype that Americans wanted Afghanistan and Afghan women to be was they wanted Afghan women to be meek and accepting of their lot, unhappy, needing saving by the US, but still primarily living in an Islamic government. RAWA was not meek, was vehemently against the burqa, said that it was a personal choice and it should have absolutely nothing to do with religion. They stand in solidarity with Iranian women who are fighting against the imposition of the hijab. And they wanted democracy and they wanted secularism, right? Secularism was seen as a Western value. But these are Afghan women inside Afghanistan. They're not Afghan American women. They're not Western women. And so RAWA was criticized by diaspora Afghan women for being secularists, for being too Western. And then if you read a lot of RAWA's literature, they used to publish this magazine called Payam-e-Zan, which stands for Women's Voice. And it was a magazine that they would, the pages were filled with documentation of the horrific crimes of the warlords and the Taliban. RAWA did not hold back. They wanted the world to see, and they wanted their own people to see the awful crimes. I mean, so there would be photos of maimed people and, bloody faces and very dramatic language, right? If you read RAWA's writing, when it's translated into English, for some Americans, it turns them off. They use very dramatic language, the language of sort of poetic, and the warlords with their bloody hands dripping in the blood of the Afghan people. So they would use this very dramatic language, and it would turn some people off. from outside Afghanistan, because this was just seen as too, a little weird for them. So they weren't Afghan enough, and they were too Afghan. And it was really challenging for me to keep reminding people to stop tone policing these women, right? If they are raging and outraged and angry, and if their language reflects that, it's because they've lived through 40 years of war. How would you express yourself if you lost your family, if you saw your husband massacred by US-backed warlords, or lost your children due to starvation because of the war? Maybe you would write like that too, or speak like that too. So that has been challenging. There was this awful article written in the American Prospect by Noy Trubka in the early 2000s, What Afghan Women Want. And it was just this terrible screed against Rawa, which was quoting Afghan Americans accusing Rawa of not being Afghan enough. And it just outraged me. So I've always tried to take my lead from Rawa. Those are my people. They're leftist, unabashedly leftist women. They're secularists. Those all align with my values. They are revolutionary. They are non-violent. They emphasize education. And so those are my people in Afghanistan, if you will. And I take my lead from them. And if their demands don't fit with the demands of other Afghan women in Afghanistan, so be it. I don't find myself in commonality with, the pro-Trump women here in the US. So that's sort of how I view my solidarity with Rawa.
Well, and I think that's an important point, Sonali, is that the U.S. tried to homogenize the women of Afghanistan, and it is so different. And also, it's been all about the Taliban, but the Taliban is one form. It's a religious form, and it's a fundamentalist form that was brought to Afghanistan from Saudi Arabia. So we're also here talking about the women of Afghanistan, but the women of Saudi Arabia suffer under the same, strict rules and covering, and can't go out without a male escort, et cetera, et cetera. But you also have the Pashtun rules, that the honor rules. And so even just the different cultures that each of those bring, and the struggle between them, the people at the most effect of that are the women. But
yeah, and actually you were saying earlier about Taliban being, there's an important historic and geographic context, right? And I know you know it, Jody, but maybe for our audience, just to remind them, there are many different ethnic groups in Afghanistan. The plurality are Pashtuns, and the Pashtun ethnic group is not just in Afghanistan. It spans from northern Pakistan to southern Afghanistan. And it's literally historically known as Pashtunistan. And of course, just like the British did in so many other parts of the world, when they left their colonial occupation, they drew a geographic line cutting through Pashtunistan in order to set up future instability, which is precisely what they got. So the Pashtun population was cut in half. You have Pashtuns in Pakistan, you have Pashtuns in Afghanistan, and many of them see themselves as Pashtun first and Pakistani or Afghan second. And the Pakistani government in the 1990s took advantage of this. And it was, in fact, under Benazir Bhutto, the woman prime minister of Pakistan, that the Taliban were formed as an army in the madrasas, the Islamic schools of Pakistan, to send them as a force into Afghanistan to take over a country that they saw to their north. They saw an opportunity. It's in chaos. There's a civil war. Let's fund this militia that wants to go in and take over and bring the political power of the Pashtuns to Afghanistan. I mean, think about the fact that the British colonial decision reverberates today in what the Taliban have done, and so today, of course, the Taliban is at least by some reports more Afghan than Pakistani. It's expanded, it's morphed, it's changed it a little bit, and it's not really clear where their allegiances lie. but they seem more Afghan than Pakistani. I don't know exactly, but yeah. So that history is so important, right, Jody?
Yeah, and I think, you know, one of the big question is, and you started with creativity, and I want to say that the war economy takes away our creativity. And you were talking about allowing the great creativity of the women that are in Afghanistan. By giving the women in Afghanistan the money instead of building weapons with it, that creativity can nourish like their ideas of what life could look like, and then put them in a more equal power relationship with the men who seem to care a lot about money. Just like, and so why don't we come up with those solutions? I think that the question is that right now we live in wars are being waged all over the world. The US has like 900 bases around the world. It's an empire that some of us live inside of, that is falling apart. It's in its last breaths of, I think, the last breaths of a dying empire, but it could take another 40 years. I think I started dying about 92 is when I said, oh, this is going down. And I was like, oh, if it's like Rome, it'll take another 75. I won't be here for it. You know, how do we look at the situation and say, what are the solutions? And I loved that Doug said, you know, small is beautiful, and that we're trying to, all the solutions have been these giant, you know, big, lots of money. And then you have Rawa, which really is the small is beautiful. And so here are the two extremes. And I would say Rawa is a reflection of the gifting society. It is about care. It is about going in and making sure that the needs are met of the people. And how do we raise up that value in this moment when war has failed and weapons have failed? Yeah, we have the largest military budget in the history of the United States. And how do we model that in a way that that story gets told, and the responses to it get seen? I think is the big question.
I love what you said about putting money into the hands of women. It really reminded me of this one very interesting Rawa project that was unlike their other projects. Most of their projects have been on health and education. They had this one project. It was a water canal project in the western province of Farah. And what was happening was there were several, and Rawa has a basin in Farah province, and there were several villages that were fighting over scarce water resources. You know, Afghanistan is a harsh country. It's very beautiful. In fact, it's one of the most jaw-droppingly beautiful countries you'll ever see if you leave the cities. Unbelievable beauty. It's a very agrarian society still in the rural part. So there's these, you know, villagers that live on subsistence farming, and they didn't have enough water resources. The US military was going around building wells wherever they could, draining the water tables. The wells were drying up. And Rawa, together with the villagers who were fighting over water resources, came up with this incredible water canal project that would divert water to, rather share water between two big villages. And we funded that project, and I went and visited that in 2005, and it was a remarkable project. And the men in the village came out with Rawa members, and they were so happy. And these two villages were living in peace with one another because they had the resources they needed because of this women-led canal project. And by the way, all of the men that I met in Afghanistan, you know, these are the fathers and the brothers and the husbands and the sons of Rawa members. They were so supportive of women's rights and women's education. Rawa's school project, they had this big school called Danish School, which means knowledge. The headmaster is a man. Most of the rest of the teachers are women, but there's some male teachers. And we met the fathers of girls going to this school who were so grateful there was a school for their daughters to go to. You know, and I think it's really important that we not paint all Afghan men with the same brush. Many of them want the same things that others do, right? Especially if they have forward-thinking women by their side, leading them to sense. So yeah, though that one project is still one of my favorite projects.
That's so inspiring. Thank you, Sonali. Yeah, well, I think that's the gifting society. That's the creative, the war economy doesn't allow us to be creative. One of the things it does is just crush our creativity and make us fit in these narrow bandwidths of what answers to questions could be, instead of having the space opened up to, well, what's a solution for all of us here? And I think there you're talking about what I think the Gifting Society is about, is what is the solutions for all of us? And the thing I saw that was heartbreaking in Kabul was everybody in Kabul cared about them and what was in Kabul. And you could see that the rest of Afghanistan was left behind. And I call that war economy culture. And Jen says in the chat, we have to change the values of the United States. I would say we need to change the values of the powerful and the rich in the United States, because I believe that people, as Sonali said, are people, and if you get caught in the spiral of the corruption, or I call the U.S. government the mafia, it can be devastating. But given the care and being inside of the peace economy, you feel the abundance and feel that you're there for each other. You'll make these right decisions, as Sonali described, which is super inspiring. Okay, so I guess we're now into time for question and answer. And so I'll just read the questions and see what comes, whether Sonali or I have an answer. So from Lori Amy, I'm feeling a huge importance in the intersection of the general's war economy and NGIOization. In Albania, where I'm based and working, and Kosovo, both with many Afghans airlifted here while documents are being processed for resettlement, is on the receiving end of huge funds for developing a military base. And a country has become a kleptocracy under US EU development paradigms. I'm hearing justifications like, this is to stabilize the country in what people are seeing as the Eastern Front in a new war on terror. Yeah. Sonali, do you want to say anything?
I mean, I'm sorry. That's all I can say as an American. I'm so sorry. It's what I said in Afghanistan to the women who were widowed by US bombs. I'm so sorry that our tax dollars are used in this destructive way, and that I feel like I am here to make reparation for it. And we have to keep reminding ourselves through people to people solidarity that our actions are not our government's actions are not reflective of our values, and we have to keep distinguishing ourselves from what our government does in our name with our tax dollars. I'm so sorry that that there's an Eastern Front, that where people are seeing it as an Eastern, seeing that there might be this dangerous potential Eastern Front in the war on terror.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. It is part of the war economy. It's that they just keep making these stories up for why they have to go somewhere. And like you said, the stabilization, there's nothing stabilizing about weapons and war in your country, nothing. One of our campaigns at CODEPINK is to try to stop the sale of weapons, because it is basically just a boondoggle. And I made a film about it, The Shadow World, which is kind of depressing, which is about weapons sale. And the weapons, really horrible weapons dealer, says, why don't they just give the money back and forth instead of destroying the planet? Because it really is just about greed. And we are trying in the United States, we have a Cut the Pentagon campaign at CODEPINK, and trying to make a big tent out of the hashtag Cut the Pentagon, because everything matters that the Pentagon is cut, including the safety in your own country. When weapons are sold to a country, that makes them less safe, not more safe. So when they try to use safety and security and bring weapons in, it's a lie, and you should call them on it. And you should raise that up, find a way to tell that story, because we're trying to close bases, and we're trying to close all the 800 bases. We have a call for a $350 billion cut in the Pentagon budget. And it would just be cutting the bases would be enough. And we then also have this campaign to stop weapons sales, because it's just a cash machine. But like you say, in your country, then it becomes destabilizing. And then, you know, you get used. Talk to the people in North Korea what it's like to be used in a war between two powers. It's the ugliest thing I've ever seen in my life. That the U.S. bombed the entire country. A general went to Congress and said there's nothing left to bomb. And 80% of the people of a country were casualties of war, either wounded or dead. And that Eisenhower cried when he heard about it. And that's why he said, beware the congressional industrial military complex. When those weapons are put in a country like yours, I say you don't love that country because you have made them vulnerable. And so take any opportunity you can to tell that story, to scream out about it, because it helps us to be able to say those bases need to be closed.
Thank you, Jody. I'm just checking in with Jen. Did you have any comments or questions for either one, Sonali or Jody, or both?
Well, it's so devastating, the whole situation. You know, every time I encounter such descriptions of the truth, I'm just horrified about the country and the century we're living in. And, you know, the destruction of the environment that goes along with all of this destruction of humanity and of the abundance that we would have to share if we had a gifting economy instead of a capitalist market, which exploits gifts and takes all the gifts of everyone. And I just I'm really appreciative of your all's take on the whole thing and ability to share what you know. I don't have any questions except just I would be interested in knowing about COVID. Is there COVID in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I mean, you know, when the Taliban took over in August, right? Yeah. Rawa said everyone's forgotten about COVID when that happened. They were seen as a bigger threat than COVID. But it would be really great if the US could also focus some of its efforts on making sure everybody in Afghanistan had access to vaccines as they pulled out, but I don't think they ever cared.
Right.
Jody, does your campaign might have any insight working with all of those doctors and care people?
Yeah, the COVID isn't as rampant as probably some of the other countries, but the doctors say right now that they're not getting the funding they need to actually be doing much of anything, which is the bigger concern. And operating under fear is not helpful either. So I think what Sonali says is right, is that the fear of so much more layered on top of COVID.
Yes, thank you. So let me just go to Liliana. I see that there's some comments and questions coming up in the chat, or if you have one that you'd like to pose for our guests.
Yes, there's a question from Jeffrey Turnbull to everyone, to both of the speakers. What is the baseline problem and what is the real cure?
Well, I think Jen said it earlier. The baseline problem is capitalism, and which I call the war economy, which is extractive, destructive, and oppressive, and affects everybody's brain that is sucking at the tit of it. You know, it's like, if that's where you think life comes from, it's horrible, and it will cause you to behave horribly, because you think it takes your thinking off of what it is to be human and what it is to be inside of the gifting economy, which is really, I think, the human economy, what it is to be human, and the way Sonali described Rawa finding the solution that served everyone is throughout time. If you know, if you look at religions, if you look at philosophy throughout time, it is how do we care for each other? And we've just gotten so freaking lost and caught up in things that don't matter because we're so lost. And you know, I talked about solving the big with the big. It's like in Washington, they don't know how to think about the small, but it's where everything happens. What Sonali described is the place where everything happens. So if we just went back to, and it's what we do at CODEPINK, like half of our time has to be spent cultivating a local peace economy, because, you know, we're trying to end war inside of a war economy, and that's like a pretty futile task. So, but we have to do it. It's kind of, you can't let it just be off and running. You've got to be pulling its pants down every day, at least to slow it down. And, but at the same time, if we're just spending our time trying to end the war, we're not cultivating what needs to take its place. And I think we haven't all, I call it the folly of fretting. If we step out of the folly of fretting and the wringing of hands, let the moment that Jen just described, if really the deep, deep pain of what is present in the world that we live in, and know that it's happening somewhere that only they can affect. And I said this to Obama. He's like, we're not going to fix Afghanistan anytime soon. I said, you will never fix Afghanistan. Only the Afghans can create their country and their culture. We've already messed it up bad enough. Like, it's going to take generations to find help. But what I didn't know then, which was in 2009, was that actually it happens much faster. That we are nature. We are just as resilient as nature. And in some of the places in the last 7 years where people have decided to just spend their lives cultivating their local peace economy, profound, amazing things have happened that I never could have imagined. And that actually in 7 years, you can remake a culture. You can remind people who they are. They can pull themselves out of the fear mongering of the war economy, of the ways that it devalues human life. And that so much of the wounding that we live inside of in the world right now is driven by the war economy, is driven by the non-acceptance of who we are just as a precious human being, that we've forgotten how to just be there with what is human and closest to us. So as an activist, you know, when I teach activism, the first thing I always teach is you can only change the person closest to you. And that's the person, because that person trusts you. And it could be the person closest to you in thinking and values. It could be, you know, a person that has watched you and learned to trust you. But the psyche can't break its mold without something to stand on that's stronger. And I saw this happen when we were trying to stop the war in Iraq, and 65% of the United States was for the war in Iraq. And I told Cindy Sheehan to go knock on Bush's door down at his ranch and ask him what noble cause her son died for. Because I'm always looking for the apple pie, the thing that is most human, that we all then can align with. In that moment, you can create big changes because it's apple pie. It's basic human. When he didn't answer her question, and when she stayed there and waited for an answer for a month, that triggering point left people past what was in their brain to another thought. And a month later, 65% of the country was against the war. And, you know, I only understood it when this guy, was, you know, we're in Texas, and he comes up with his hat and he's kind of short and he's got his boots and he's coming up the mound that I'm standing on with Cindy. And I'm like, oh, we're going to get yelled at or something. And instead, he said, you can't do that to a mother who sent her child to war. You can't do that. And that was it. It was like, you can't treat somebody seeing that leaps over the argument War and Peace and sees a human being treated wrong. And we've got to, some damage has been done. And we've got to go back to the responsibility. We live in a country full of like, what is my right? But in Indigenous culture, it's what is my obligation? And so I love the what is my obligation, because it connects me to my community. And I've watched so many people, after learning about the war economy, peace economy, going and really giving themselves to the peace economy. And it's just profound. And I have watched capitalists become socialists overnight, when they really understand the cost and what they really want out of their heart, and that they're in the way of it, has been profound. And what it is to put your hands in soil. This summer was called Planting Seeds of Peace, with the local peace economy members, none of whom had ever even had a garden. And getting the stories back of what it is just to grow something. You know, what it is to be in relationship with something that has to grow. Think of how those values are so different from, I'm going to throw $760 billion at weapons and bomb something. It's just, if you start to grow and cultivate local peace economies, and people start to remember what it is to be in human relationship, what it is to care for each other. First of all, it's so rewarding. Some of the letters I get back about, oh my God, did you know that we live in a field of generosity? We're just like, yes, but we're so busy being attached to a war economy that we're not, you know, we're not seeing even the level of generosity that surrounds us, the level of care, as Jen would say, that without which none of us would be alive. To be re-engaged in that and re-expressive of that, I can say everybody says they've never worked harder in their life, but they've never been more fulfilled. And the level of creativity and that comes out of being freed, and that, you know, in the place where Rawa lives, the values they live out of are the caring economy values. And so then they're able, in the spaces they are, to be cultivating the peace economy that we need. And, you know, we look at the problem and we want to throw something big at it. And my answer is always, but it's small. It's you. It starts with you. And whenever you feel yourself in the folly of fretting, and whenever I feel myself in the fearing pain of what so many people live inside of on this beautiful planet, in this moment in history, I only can like take out my own shovel and start shoveling. And we don't want to hear that. We live in an empire. I want to say that those of us that are privileged and benefit from the privileges of this also time in history, we need to be humbled a little bit. We need to be humbled into ourselves. That when we find ourselves looking for big answers, that it comes out of that empire thinking, and that we should reward ourselves for the small, the answers that are small, but that serve everyone around us, and that you can see that, and you can learn from it. Because I'm really learning this from we have a campaign called China's Not Our Enemy, because the US now is targeting all that war power from Iraq and Afghanistan over to China, and lying the same ways, using things that would open up hearts to drive war. And one of the things that's interesting as I'm studying China is they iterate so fast there. And I never really thought about how in the United States, very little changes. But in China, change happens so fast. And it's because they iterate. And it's one of the things I think we don't do in the war economy, but that does happen in the peace economy. It's like mothering. Any mother would know this, that you're paying attention and learning as fast as your child is paying attention and learning. And you're iterating to the needs. And as I watched that in China, you can see it in little projects. Like there's this one most beautiful place in China, I think. And it had a lake. It's one of the 5th largest lakes in the world. And it was totally polluted, horrible, smelled. You couldn't even be near it. It smelled so bad. It is now one of the cleanest lakes in potable water in 7 years. So I want to offer that it takes, I also want to say that it takes 9 months. It takes a commitment of 9 months. So I think it's kind of funny about birthing and 9 months and gestation for the peace economy to fully like enter you and you to own it and to kind of break out of the patterns. But once that happens, the change is just it's like a rocket ship of how fast the change can take place. And so I want to say that the big can happen, but it takes the commitment to the small. And even as I've watched, like I said, watching some capitalists I never thought would change, this one woman's giving all her money away, and she's giving it to Indigenous, Black, and Brown communities that already had started a community that had been abandoned or in some way violated by the war economy coming in, and giving them the money to figure out what would their community look like, and just giving it to them. So when I say, you know, like, what would it be just to give the money to the place where you're trying to save? That in being the savior, you've created the problem, and in solidarity, you offer what you have to be used by who you've offered it to in the way that they see fit. And in our empire thinking, we don't think that way. We think we know better. We think there's a lot of we think we know better, and I think have also a lot to learn ourselves.
Thanks, Jody. Thank you very much. That was very in-depth. I think the thing that I'm noticing a lot is this common theme that comes back to, we need to give it to the women directly. And if we can get the money to the women and the choices of, you know, maybe it's a small effort or a large effort, that it needs to be accessed by the women, and the women will take care of families and children. And we've seen that in our own lives, and we've seen it in many, many other places. And Sonali talks about how critically important that is. And that little tiny shift in the war economy, because we're looking for a top-down solution. When we look at for big solutions, we're looking at top-down. Like somehow, somebody who's controlling the big picture is going to be able to change the minds and hearts of every individual involved. And we're looking for a solution that actually is well-grounded. When Sonali talks about what's happening on the ground, and Jody, when you're talking about what's happening on the ground, and you're talking about how these women and children had to fold out of Afghanistan into bordering countries, that they need to be supported, because we've created a problem. Those of us who are from the United States have created a problem, and those are Afghanis that are now displaced. The war economy is displacing the poor and the people who don't have access to resources. So I think that's a very awkward shift in our mindset, which is why the gift economy, the maternal gift economy in particular, is very difficult to identify, because it seems non-essential, but it's vital for life. We cannot live, a child cannot live, an organization cannot live, women in solidarity cannot live without women supporting women so they can support their children. That a war economy, a peace economy cannot be birthed out of a war economy. It must be birthed out of people who understand peace and what that means to them first personally in their own lives and around them. And I just think this has been really fabulous. And I'm checking to see, Sonali, do you have anything that you wanted to share or respond to, or Jen, to what Jody just offered? I know that there are comments that are coming up and possibly questions, but I want you to know, those of you who are with us today, that whatever questions or comments will be shared with both Jody and Sonali, along with our attendees. They'll get the email list so that they'll be able to see your comments, and perhaps if they have time to respond to you directly. So Sonali?
If you want to help Afghan women, and I'm about action, hold a local fundraiser. We've had so many amazing efforts just in the last few months. There have been like art auctions. A collective of artists in France held this incredible auction that they did on their own entirely, and they just kept us updated and raised money for RAWA, another an Iranian-led beer manufacturer, Iranian-American beer manufacturer, like a craft beer company, auctioned off their first 2 cases of beer, of these really cool Iranian flavored beer, as fundraiser for Afghan Women's Mission. I mean, you can do so many things. You can have a bake sale, do something in your own community. If you want to support Afghan women and express solidarity with them, one great way is to do a little event and raise money for RAWA. I remember when the film A View from a Grain of Sand, which Jody was referring to earlier, by our mutual friend Meena Nanji, when that film first came out, we had viewing events all over the country where people held viewing parties in their homes, invited their friends over and raised money. They would watch the film together, they would learn about RAWA, they would have a lot of questions and talk amongst each other, and then they would pass the hat and then send us a check. And it was a great way to ensure that there's some compensation for the damage that our tax dollars have done through our government, that we can put some of our own money into the hands of women like RAWA members. So you can find out all about how RAWA works at their website, rawa.org, rawa.org. I should warn you, the English language version of that website has not been updated in a long time because they've just been so busy. If you speak Persian or Dari, that's the much more up-to-date version of the website. Our website is afghanwomensmission.org, where you can find the address to send checks or to make online donations. So, take action. If this has inspired you, if it's upset you, if it's made you want to do something, if you instead of feeling bad or shutting down or pontificating, take action. That would be my suggestion.
Thank you, Sonali. Judith, I want to call on you and see if you have any questions or any of the comments that you'd like to read out for our guests. And
Jody talked about Pakistan and China, and Angela Dolmetsch is mentioning her eco-village of Nashira, but I wonder if you could give us some more examples, which I find very inspiring, of successful peace economies.
So when you say successful at peace economy, I think of pretty much any indigenous culture that hasn't been invaded by capitalism or the war economy, generally was a successful peace economy. And the value, the iteration was always present. What does it take to be responsible for life? I mean, basically, has been the core of indigenous communities. And what's interesting is that when the war economy starts, when it's really something happens that life is not a value anymore. When you can get a brain to decide that life is not in value anymore, you can use it for anything. And we see that it's, beautiful things and horrible things. I mean, what is it to create a nuclear weapon? I mean, what kind of, there were some of the scientists that understood that that was not a good thing for life. But we don't need to make something up. We can just look back and see what were there's so much wisdom out of indigenous cultures on every continent that can help us learn, unlearn and learn our way back into how do we be in relationship together. And I think everybody wants to do it and have an iPhone, you know, that's and be on Facebook. So it's a more difficult problem to create out of this thing that this monster that's grown so many heads that it's hard to figure out how to be out of it. And so I don't think you can from here. I think the more you practice your way into the peace economy, you can answer those questions because you're there and that's where your brain is. And you'll figure out what you want to let go of and what you can rationalize to hold on to. And then you have to think about what slave made that and what part of the earth was destroyed for that. But I think we're all making compromises that I don't think we're conscious of and we don't understand the prices of. But I think into how many people fought how hard for life for so many years. You know, why don't we? Why we don't even ask that question? Why we can let these behaviors bring us to the brink of extinction and not be curious about ourselves? And I just think that question has been one that has started people walking out of the war economy into something else. And so I don't know, we can't go back to an indigenous culture, but we can start to craft something new that's reflective of those values, reflective of a respect and a valuing of the planet that gives us so much, a respect and a valuing of the mothering, the caring, the needs it is for a human to live. I mean, we can just even see it with China and the US in COVID. And, you know, that caring sometimes is not allowing something to happen so something can close down so that less people die. And that 1.5 billion people can decide to take care of each other. And that, yes, there'll be 100 million of those that'll fight it. But the weight of the 1.4 billion on top of the 100 million that, you know, are fighting it moves everyone closer to all being well. And I just, you know, just look at those two forms of what is it like to choose for others, to feel some responsibility, some obligation to others, instead of living out, I have a right to be spoiled brat. I mean, I think that's another piece of this that we have to grapple with. And the United States of America behaves like a spoiled brat around the world, that everything is theirs, they can have it for whatever it takes at whatever cost. And we in the United States have normalized death. We saw it normalized with Madeleine Albright saying that the death of 500,000 Iraqi children from US sanctions was acceptable collateral damage. It is what the number of deaths in Afghanistan were there to help the mothers. Who do they think they killed? I will not raise my child to kill another mother's child. They killed those women's children. They killed those women. It's just bullshit. 1 million people are dead in the war on terror and $21 trillion spent. In this moment in history, we each get to decide how we respond to that. And I think, you know, being that maternal gift of life to life is more important than ever.
Thank you, Jody. Thank you. Sonali, did you have anything that you might want to offer to that comment?
I think Jody said it best. Yeah.
Perfect.
I don't know if anyone has any specific questions about Afghanistan for me, I can answer those.
But I
Yeah.
had promised Sonali, her parents just arrived from India, that this would be an hour, and she stayed an hour and a half.
Okay.
So I'll stay for the extra half hour, but I want to
I'm
let
sorry,
Sonali
yeah.
be
I
with
have
her parents.
two kids and two elderly parents, so that's all right if you don't mind me
Thank you so much,
saying
Sonali.
goodbye.
Thank you so much, Sonali.
Thank you so much, Jody, and I appreciate everyone. So yes, please do support Rawa if you can.
Beautiful.
Take care.
Thank
Okay,
you.
bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay. Jen, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, yeah. We all have mothers. Everybody has a mother. And the exchange economy comes into a person's life when they're, well, between 3 or 4 or 5 years old. They begin to learn. The babies don't know anything about quid pro quo and having to give back an equivalent of what they've received. And we all, indigenous people and capitalist people, are born from mothers, and we all experience that model. But the indigenous people have kept theirs in that model, in their economy and in their culture. And the capitalist people have abolished it and actually made the exchange economy, the monetized economy, parasitic on the gift economy. Profit is really just taking the gifts of the people that are not paid enough or of nature, and taking that profit and keeping it for yourself, privatizing it to the people that already have money through a capitalist way of doing things. And so yeah, that was analyzed like by Marx as surplus labor. And there's also, like you say, the war economy, the kind of governmental extraction of taxes from people to use on anti-life things. And so we have two economies, one that's based on exchange and the market, and the other that's based on gifting, and one is parasitic on the other. And we have to make emerge that gift economy, even in the ideas that people have and the values people have, in order to transform what we're doing. We can't keep on doing this. Our species is going to die. And we're actually a maternal species. We're not a Homo economicus. We're Homo materno. We're Homo donans, the giving species. That's my soapbox. I'll just leave it at that for you.
That's beautiful. We need that to be said. I think it's really important for each of us to really consider. I love this notion, Jody, that you brought up, that in CODEPINK, that whatever your projects are, you have to spend 50% of your time cultivating a peace economy. And I would venture to ask any one of us, how are you spending? You know, what if you personally spent 50% of your personal time really in that inquiry? Because the peace economy is the maternal gift economy. If you spent 50% of your time doing that, we would be emerging into a place of peace. Like Jody said, perhaps like dominoes sort of falling over with grace and ease, as opposed to the confrontational aggression that we feel rises up when we have our anxiety of what Jody calls the folly of fretting. You know, that's actually a first world opportunity, that we have this, you know, opportunity to have folly in fretting. First, you know, indigenous people, people who are in Afghanistan, in all the wars around the world, do not have the folly of fretting. Every day they're in a place of survival. And I would just venture to really consider that. And I see that we have a little bit more time. And I wonder if Liliana, you might have a question that you might, or a comment you'd like to read out for Jody to respond to.
Yeah, Paola Melchiori from Italy says, we also follow what Rawa says. It is useful to do. And now they, as you say, they don't particularly work on getting people out, but they say raise money to help continue what we were doing and do not allow the attention of women to drop from our country. That was from Paola Mercuri from Italy.
Was that a question?
It's a comment.
Yeah.
It's a comment, yes.
Yeah.
And I think that
I do want to address the question from Ursula from Germany about building a peace economy in a refugee camp in Kenya, Kakuma, Block 13. So refugee camps. Let's just like, the whole concept of a refugee camp itself is so wrong. And it's part of that NGOization that we talked about earlier. I think there's nothing more NGOized than a refugee camp. And I think it's how to, it's about creating home. It's about cultivating a peace economy. And inside of a refugee camp, it's really, as I talk to the women in them, it's life on pause and it's life without life. And I think the thing that we can do in the work, in the refugee work, is to, as quickly as possible, find ways to integrate people into communities. And that you know, that's totally part of the, you know, what is it in us that put them off in a camp somewhere else? What is that about us that is, it's like everybody has these religions that are love one another. It's just like, it's so uncaring. And it's like, how little money can we spend, and how cold and dark and wet and oppressive could this situation be in situations that were created by the behavior of those that are the elite, the United States, the NATO countries. The devastation has been caused by capitalism. You know, I want to bring the women in Haiti into this. You know, we're talking about the women in Afghanistan, but the United States government has done the same devastation to Haiti. And these were the liberated people that we then oppressed. They liberated themselves. I mean, the United States of America exists because of Haiti, because it crushed Napoleon, who had to give up and, you know, fire sale, you know, the Louisiana Purchase. And then, you know, so it's addressing, I appreciate you, Ursula, having this question, but the questions need to be, it's like, how do I bring the peace economy to the problem I see, the problem that lights my heart? I feel your heart has been lit up by this situation. And I think the thing that we each need to bring is new thinking. And it's why I say, when you live inside of the peace economy, you bring new thinking because you're already thinking differently. I mean, and you can only do it by being it. I mean, it's just, you can't fake this shit. So if you want to stay in the war economy and have your life filled with that and hold on to the NGO complex because it's supporting your life, is the story you tell yourself, then you're not going to be able to solve these problems. But if you bring the fresh thinking in, I've watched amazing things be able to happen in refugee camps by coming up with different thinking, by being the caring economy person that you are and breaking down some of the horrificness in it. You know, creating opportunities for the women to cook for each other instead of like horrible food, by creating kitchens out of the tent, by creating playrooms, by not siloing everyone. You know, like it becomes a silo place. And part of what capitalism does is silo us. These patterns of siloing, of alienating, of a transaction instead of relationship. You know, the ways that you can practice the peace economy every day is just pick a thing. There's 21 ways to divest from the war economy on the CODEPINK website, and just pick one each week and practice it. And you'll be, I mean, we practice the peace economy at CODEPINK, and we have transformed ourselves as a community, as a team, and as a community, just by the practices of really recognizing how immediately we respond as a transaction instead of a relationship. How immediate, you know, like how we take refuge in the silo instead of, it's like we call it the hard work of relationship, but that's all there is. It's like, what are you here for but to relate, to be in relationship with? What other point is there? When you think about that we're born and we die, and that we've latched ourselves onto this really oppressive thing called the war economy. It's just depressing. And, you know, being able to be free of that. And like I said, people recognizing the band of generosity that we do live inside of, and that we're forced to make choices out of what we call survival. But, you know, actually survival doesn't take that much. It's really fascinating. And I practiced it when I was a mom. I took my kids on the road. I couldn't afford the utilities at my house. So I rented it out for the summer, and I took my kids on the road and showed them how little it took to live, and how much generosity there was out there, and also how much adventure, how much fun, how much, you know, delight. And so I have two boys who live in the peace economy that never attached themselves to the war economy. And it was because it didn't feel comfortable to them. That for them, always what, you know, my oldest son would never, it would feel like a violation of who he was to in any way attach himself to the war economy. And my youngest son is a Buddhist priest who spends his life taking care of the refugees of the war economy. So I think you know the answer to the question because it's in your heart, but don't show up in the structure. Oh, do whatever you can to take the structures of the war economy and sand them down to become the forms of care, instead of the forms of, as Jen says, of theft, of, you know, of oppression and extraction.
Thank you, Jody. I'm checking the time. Jen, did you have any comments about that topic or response?
Well, not really, but thank you, Jody. I think you really said a mouthful. It's really a wonderful thing that you're doing about the peace economy. You know, I call it the gift economy because I look at it as the maternal gift. It's the economy based on the model of mothering that children receive, because if they don't receive that model, they die. You know, they have to be given to unilaterally. And somehow our society has disbelieved in unilateral giving. It's like we can't do that unless we're saints or crazy, or maybe we just do it and fool ourselves. But it's not true, because mothers have to do it, otherwise babies don't survive. And so we all have that model when children are little. And it's the exchange model. It's giving in order to get. That is the strange thing. It's the non-human model, not the gifting model, not the unilateral gift. And so I work on trying to reinstall or reinstate the idea of the unilateral gift at the basis of culture. And it is what women do when they're mothers, and baby girls learn they're supposed to continue to do it because they're going to grow up and be mothers. And boys learn they're not supposed to do it usually, and they have to follow this model of power over that usually in our culture the father has. So things are changing, thank goodness. Lots of boys are becoming more caring and maternal, and that's becoming validated in society, and women are stepping out of the slavery that they've been involved in a lot of times, and the whole mothering model is stepping out of the slavery it's been in. So, I mean, there's a whole lot of change that needs to happen in the kinds of model we believe in and take on as our own. And I believe that is part of this peace economy. And when we do that, then it is that we think like human beings instead of like neoliberal robots. So that's it.
Exactly.
Well, I put
Exactly.
in the chat the paying of the Afghan teachers and healthcare workers, because I think the extension of mothering, because when you're done mothering, I think for me, the peace economy is finding ways to remain in that service, in the service of caring, is also necessary for life. So in the peace economy, it's like, am I in a role in the war economy where I'm extracting or destroying, or am I a role in the peace economy where I'm caring and giving and creating conditions conducive for life? Basically, I say in the peace economy, you're creating conditions conducive for life. In the war economy, you are killing yourself, the community, and the planet. So at the core of the peace economy is, I was totally infected by Jen, and became one of her teachers out there of like the maternal gift. But I had to find language to articulate it inside of the world that I'm trying to affect, which is one of war and peace. And you know, by calling capitalism the war economy, I felt it took it out of a triggered word and gave it really the meaning it has, which is it's the war economy, and war serves it. And I'm not going to end war until I can end the war economy. And then the peace economy creates conditions conducive for life. And that's what Jen's talking about in the maternal gifting. It's like creating conditions conducive for life. And so in the choice of what we would do as CODEPINK in solidarity with women in Afghanistan, it was to raise money for RAWA and support them, because it is a direct, they do follow the model of the peace economy in Afghanistan. And then it was finding a way to directly support the women. And we found out that they're outside of the government of Afghanistan. Other agencies had been putting money directly into the accounts of the teachers and the doctors, women teachers and doctors. And so that felt like a way to model directly giving the women the money. And so those are the two ways that we're trying to model the peace economy with the question of what do you do with the women in Afghanistan. I want to say we're also, Cuba's being strangled to death by the United States, and we're also just about to deliver $800,000 worth of food. We raised $500,000 so they could have enough syringes for their vaccines, and they will be able to vaccinate all of Cuba with that. So we, been able to support the women in Iran with COVID support. directly to the women. So, you know, I bring this all up because it's not just the women in Afghanistan and the world that are being violated by the United States war economy and war machine. It's vast, which is why I say you come back to where you are and you start there, because I don't know about you, but in our community there, I'm out in solidarity with the unhoused population in just my community is 7,000.
Wow. Thank you for that reminder, Jody. I see that we're getting close to the top of the hour. So I just want to say that I put in the chat a link where you can get the 21 days. It says 21 days, but it's actually the practical application of the 21 opportunities to divest from the war economy. Thank you, Jody, for joining us today yet again, to educate us and share of your wisdom, and for bringing us Sonali, and we'll write to her and share with her the other comments that have come in since she's been gone. So everyone, I just want to say thank you for joining us. Your questions and comments, again, will be shared with the panelists, and you'll be able to see the recording at our website, the maternalgifteconomy.org. If you have any other additional questions or comments, you can send them to us at maternalgifteconomy@gmail.com. And if they are to be directed to either Sonali or Jody, we will make sure that they get them. So please feel free to do that. I want to invite you back, everyone, in 2 weeks for our 22nd Salon. We'll be having Kathy Jones. Some of you may know who she is. She actually started a political party in the UK around the mother world. So she'll be coming to us October the 23rd, speaking about the mother world. And I see Darcia has joined us today, and Darcia Navarez will also be joining us, and she's going to be talking about the empty nest. So this is both for children, not the empty nest, I'm sorry, the evolved nest, that talks about how we actually move forward with these principles in raising children in a multidisciplinary way. And she has a beautiful website. So we hope you'll join us for that. And then in 4 weeks, on November the 6th, we're going to be talking about migration or immigration to the US and Europe with 2 women, one Jennifer Long from Texas, and Cecilia, what's her last name, Jen? Cavallo?
Yes, Cavallo.
Cavallo from Italy. So we hope that you will join us. And Jen, while you're on, is there anything you'd like to close with?
No, just change the economy completely, change everything so that we can survive on this beautiful planet where we belong. We are a wonderful species, and we've got to become who we really are.
Absolutely. And Jody, are there any last parting words that you'd like to give to our viewers today?
No, just thank you very much, Jen and Letitia and Liliana, for holding these spaces for us to come back to the tuning fork of where we need to be and share wisdom with each other. And just a reminder, you know, it's yeah, there's big problems out there, and where you can affect is where you can affect. And I encourage you to do that, to be in effect to the world around you.
Thank you so much, Jody. And we thank Sonali for being here, Liliana and Judith for watching, for questions, our tech support, Diane and Elena, and always Genevieve and the International Feminists for the Gift Economy. We thank you for all the work that you're doing in the world to change our consciousness and to make this a better world, safer for women and children. So everyone, please, we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Be well, stay safe, and be kind to one another. Take good care, everyone. We'll see you soon. Bye for now.
Bye. Thank you, Letitia.
Thank you.